Okay, good evening to all of you. Welcome here again to our conference and the University of Zurich. A special welcome to our Dean of the Philosophical Faculty, Katja Michailova, who's honoring us with her presence tonight. I am Francis Schenemal. I hold the chair in political philosophy here at the University of Zurich. I have the pleasure to co-host this conference. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to announce Peter Maurer as a keynote speaker of our conference, Navigating Humanitarian Negotiation. Peter Maurer was, as you know, the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross for 10 years, from 2012 to 2022. I think he stands for Swiss diplomacy at its best. He entered the Swiss diplomatic service in 1987, held various positions abroad until he was appointed ambassador and head of the division in charge of human security at the headquarters of Switzerland's foreign ministry in Bern. That's where I first got to know Peter Maurer. In 2004, he was appointed ambassador of Switzerland to the United Nations in New York. There again, I had the pleasure to meet him when I was working for the UNDP as a rapporteur. In January 2010, he became Switzerland's State Secretary for Foreign Affairs, a position he held until he was elected president of the International Committee of the Red Cross in June 2012. At the ICRC, Peter Maurer oversaw a historic expansion of operations during a time when humanitarian tragedies increased in number and in duration. In international diplomacy, the president of the ICRC has the status of a head of state. But contrary to heads of state, the president of the ICRC has more than one state to worry about. Under Peter Maurer's 24/7 leadership of the organization, he oversaw humanitarian work in 80 countries and more. Peter Maurer is currently the president of the Basel Institute on Governance, which was founded by, I think, Professor Mead from the University of Basel, which is an anti-corruption governance institution. Peter Maurer pursues many other activities. For instance, he is a member of the International Gender Champions. He's a member of the board of the World Economic Forum. He co-chairs the Global Future Council on the future of the humanitarian system, the World Economic Forum. And he's a member of the advisory board of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Peter Maurer holds a doctorate from the University of Bern, but also honorary doctorates from the University of Basel and Waseda University in Japan. He was also awarded the Knight Commander's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany in 2023. So now, without much further ado, Mr. Maurer, Peter, thank you so much for being here. Please take the floor.
Madam Dean, Francis, Jack, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, it's a great honor for me to be here with you and to talk about negotiations, humanitarian negotiations, and their perspective in the broader landscape of negotiations today. Let me start with a story. When a little bit more than 30 years ago, I was in an internal discussion in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland, and I used negotiation and humanitarian in the same sentence. A colleague of mine from the humanitarian section stood up and said, there is nothing like humanitarian negotiation. Either you are a humanitarian and then you are a principled humanitarian, or you are engaged in diplomatic and political negotiation and then you make a compromise. But the two together, they don't exist. Really? Today, we have been more accustomed, more attuned to negotiations happening in all areas of life, including in humanitarian work and at all levels of state and society. Negotiations come in different shapes and forms and degrees of complexity. They are trained, researched, broadly discussed wherever you look, so that when I go to a bookshop, I never know whether to find negotiation literature in the business, the political, or the self-help section of the bookstore. We see negotiations referred to as skill, as function, as profession, as an art, and as science. And therefore, we have become more accustomed to seeing negotiations as an all-encompassing, multi-stakeholder, multi-perspective enterprise in society. Negotiations are, in fact, a reflection of a fundamental human experience, finding agreement with others while having very different views, interests, and approaches to contemporary challenges to society. So everybody can participate into the discussion through his own experience or her own experience on what negotiations is and some of the key dilemmas. Who would not have anything to participate on principled and pragmatic approaches to negotiation, on short-term gains and long-term sustainability of results, between the dilemma between strategic, tactical, and practical issues coming to negotiating tables, between professional and public policy considerations that you may have in negotiations, between compromise and rotten compromise reflected in negotiation results, between success at the negotiation table and ratification of results at home or within your own constituencies, between agreement on text and implementation of agreement. We all know from different areas of life that these are critical dilemmas of negotiation everywhere and every place and in all perspectives. You have all gone through that, and fortunately universities teach negotiations and train and research because we have become slightly more sophisticated in how to approach negotiations. Looking at the humanitarian world, the Center of Competence on Frontline Humanitarian Negotiations that we initiated at ICRC in 2014 has not silenced the concerns that certain humanitarian actors had at the beginning, and which I was referring to, that principles might be deprioritized during negotiations. Yes, debating and conceptualizing humanitarian frontline negotiations has allowed to soften rigid juxtaposition and ideological stances, but still the jury is out on how to reconcile negotiation and principle in humanitarian context. And this has been particularly difficult because these contexts are on the one side dominated by laws and principles, but in an environment dominated by military power and power realities on the ground. And that makes the accentuation of these two elements of negotiation and humanitarian a little bit more tricky to solve. If we look closer to the humanitarian landscape and to hundreds of millions of people and their needs who have been excluded at present from basic social services, we recognize today that the key challenges is only partly the size of the problems that we are seeing on the ground and the huge discrepancies in societies which unquestionably exist. But if we look at what the core of the problem very often is, it is access to people in need. And access is not granted or is only granted most of the time after successful humanitarian negotiations with those who carry the arms on the ground. Humanitarian negotiations, therefore, and rightly so, have been described as a set of interactions between humanitarian organizations, parties to armed conflict, state and non-state, to ensure access and delivery of humanitarian services to populations in need. And as I mentioned, they have a relational component because if we want to negotiate access, you need trust building with those who carry power on the ground. And they have a strong normative approach because they are based in international humanitarian law, in the Geneva Conventions, in the Refugee Conventions, and in a panoply of resolutions and soft law text that the international community has agreed upon over the last decades in order to solve these conundrums. Given the strong tradition of establishing humanitarian action as a unique, confidential, and personal function in these contexts, distinct from any other type of negotiations, one of the continuous challenges over the years has been to embark on a more evidence-based, reasoned, factual approach on humanitarian negotiations. The distinctiveness and similarities between humanitarian negotiations and the broader community of mediators, negotiators, facilitators on peace, security, human rights, and economic development needed to be more clearly defined and is still under sort of scrutiny of being more clearly defined on where to place humanitarian negotiations in that landscape. Over the years, building the evidence about the size, the scope, the challenges, the possible improvements, and the theory of frontline humanitarian negotiations has become a critical piece in enhancing the negotiation capacities of the humanitarian sector as a whole. I think we have done over more than 100 interviews at the beginning, hundreds of interviews since we started the Center of Competence of Frontline Negotiations in order to come to some of the common issues of concern of the humanitarian sector and to credibly decontextualize them so that we could somehow bring a theory and a more general approach to humanitarian negotiations to the forefront. The key issues, you know them, it's access, it's security, it's evacuations, it's the definition of what humanitarian essentials are. These are the common concerns of the humanitarians on the ground. They needed to be contextualized, they needed to be decontextualized and thought through in humanitarian negotiation. The Center for Frontline Humanitarian Negotiations has kind of established negotiations as a discipline and as a function. At least some elements of theory has come out over the last couple of years. It has established a broadly accepted template on planning frontline humanitarian negotiations, the so-called Naivasha grid. You can Google it and you can see what it exactly is, those who are not yet familiar with, but it is an important effort to somehow bring a concept to the whole humanitarian community. The emerging framework has offered tools to understand the role of negotiators compared to his team and mandators. We have discussed humanitarian negotiators' legitimacy. What makes the humanitarian negotiators' legitimacy? Is it competence, trust, capacity, connection, or all of it at the same time? We have more systematically thought about collective efforts needed to prepare negotiations. We have more generally pondered the issues of understanding the relational and transactional stages of negotiations. We have offered thoughts about leveraging influence and coming to islands of understanding in negotiation. We have established tools to help negotiators identify political, professional, and technical issues in a negotiation, and we have sort of critically focused on the issue of mandators of negotiations and the importance of offering some basic framework as a mandator instead of doing red lines, which never can be kept in a humanitarian negotiations. Not only access has been a critical issue, we have also learned through that more systematic effort on humanitarian negotiation to read our environment, not just as a normative crisis of respect of international humanitarian law, but have also expanded our scope into behavioral issues. Why is access denied? Why is international humanitarian law violated? We have built connectors with other areas of science. And of course, we have looked into the complexity and foreseeability of today's conflicts, which make humanitarian negotiations such a multi-layered environment in which to work. In navigating complexities, frontline humanitarian operators have encouraged us to formulate negotiating strategies in response to unpredictable nature of conflicts and non-linear behavior. And I think that's important to recognize here when we talk in the general framework of negotiation. You have unforeseeability and non-linearity in many other areas as well. But what you learn in business negotiations is basically not unlinearity, is also linearity and rationale of how to come to yes, yes. That's what Harvard teaches. I think humanitarian negotiation bring us to the challenges of dealing with the unforeseeable, the nonlinear, the surprise, and somehow hedge and steer negotiations in an environment which is less foreseeable, more unpredictable. The field manual on frontline humanitarian negotiations has been an important tool to reconcile the specific experience of the humanitarian sector with the broader negotiation community and make humanitarian negotiations teachable and trainable. It has taken humanitarian negotiations out of the realm of art and instinct into the world of function, profession, and factfulness. It may not have decomplexified the international and environment in which we are and find ourselves as humanitarians, but it has increased the capacity to deal with difficult context. It has established links between different geographies and has offered broader insights into some similarities between conflict regions and negotiation dynamics. All the CCHN negotiations, tools and methods developed through an inductive approach are open source and thus benefit to various sector and various interests of the negotiation community. Today, over 6,000 frontline humanitarian negotiators are connected on CCHN platform. Development actors, mediators, diplomats have been trained in frontline humanitarian negotiations. Around a third of them are now actively involved in strengthening the professionalization of humanitarian negotiation. The UN, Red Cross, and MSF, Doctors Without Borders, the founders of the CCHN, have stood for a programmatic effort to de-silo humanitarian negotiations and create transversal negotiating experience and cultures. I certainly appreciate the interest of other areas into that work that we have done, into that body of evidence, which, as I mentioned, is available to different kinds of interests and sectors in the future. Let me now mention some features a little bit more in detail, which may be of interest to the broader negotiator communities and which come from our lessons learned of systematizing and conceptualizing humanitarian negotiation over the last couple of years. Let me start with communities of practice. While when we founded the Center on Frontline Negotiations, this was a foundation of institutions, of the ICRC, the HCR, the World Food Programme, and Doctors Without Borders. At the same time, we found ourselves increasingly with that creation beyond institutional reflection, because basically we brought a community of practice together, which understood their role beyond institutional silos. And while the original idea was to create something which would be useful to institutions, at the end of the day, it has been useful to institutions, but it has also created tension with trans-institutional communities of practice, which basically have dominated and are increasingly dominating frontline humanitarian negotiation. It is indeed, as Etienne and Beverly Wenger Trainer, who are kinds of the gurus of communities of practice, have conceptualized. They are communities sharing best practices, creating new knowledge to advance domain of professional experience. They transcend institutional silos. The interaction is ongoing on the basis of the professional interest and not of institutional mandates. To reach its mission, the CCHN has a hub is a hub of community of practice and has been harnessing local negotiation processes and practices, capturing, analyzing these best practices and developing frameworks and tools for a broader community. And those local networks develop on their own. They are backed up by the platform, which is CCHN, but they develop on their own, they define their own agenda, they are in contact amongst themselves. CCHN as a platform facilitates those contacts, but it has led to this snowballing of the 6,000 frontline negotiators, which only on the third line of priority will identify themselves as being members of an institution, but they are members first and foremost of a profession. Interestingly, it is this community and not the organization which are the driver of collaboration around the topic of frontline negotiation. It is a radically cross-organization feature. Empirical work has led to the creation of a systematic methodology to frontline negotiation, as opposed to merely transactional behaviors. We have really developed through the community practice. Communities and civil society actors are at the forefront of humanitarian response and are often first negotiators with armed groups and authorities. The CCHN not only documents, captures, and analyzes local negotiation practice, but also feeds them back into the community of practice themselves, so interacts really as an open platform. In the hardest to reach places, not just geographically, but also where discussing negotiation is not digitally or physically safe, the CCHN, through its training and facilitators program, has created the expertise for decentralized spaces for discussions amongst groups that feel comfortable with each other and they are constituting themselves. The point, and my first point on communities of practice, is that negotiations take place driven by communities of practice, using institutions also as a platform as connectors, but they are heavily driven by communities of practice. And I think it's important. A second point I wanted to highlight is really the connection within the area of humanitarian negotiation between humanitarian diplomacy and frontline negotiation. You can understand from what I said that there are tensions building up between what frontline humanitarian negotiators think important and are a priority for them, and what humanitarian diplomats in multilateral and bilateral setting of diplomacy are articulating as problems. Most of the time, the issues articulated by frontline negotiators are seen as incremental, as small, as kind of not relevant for the political and diplomatic debate. And the frontline negotiators conceive and see humanitarian diplomats as people with fluffy words, which somehow discuss things irrelevant to the problems and to the access and security problems they are dealing. But over the past 10 years, I think I really tried hard to bring that conversation into a more fruitful debate. And I think we have seen how to capitalize on frontline insight in order to articulate what the real problems at the front lines are in political and diplomatic fora. Speaking in the Security Council, in bilateral confidential settings with ministers and heads of states and army chiefs on what frontliners tell you has been a critical feature on making humanitarian diplomacy and negotiations more credible, and also seeing the value at frontline of political support that suddenly you get when you can make a convincing case. But the relationship has never been easy and continues to be difficult, because some of the key element which makes a frontline negotiator a credible actor is trust to the belligerents. And trust to the belligerents and information which is trustful information at front lines may not be publicizable in a diplomatic and negotiating setting in a multilateral or bilateral setting. So the protocols and the exact articulation of frontline negotiation and humanitarian diplomacy is still to be found in each cases. It's difficult. You need protocols for what you can say. You need continuous interaction. I think it's important to highlight this element of tension, that one of the important element of success in a humanitarian negotiation is an internal satisfactory negotiation between your top leadership and your frontline negotiation on what to say, when to say it, how to calibrate the message, how to negotiate and articulate what is needed and what is a priority and what is not a priority. If I summarize on this point, I would say what we have seen in humanitarian diplomacy and frontline negotiation is that it needs to be connected horizontally between institutions. That was my first point on the community of practice, but vertically as well between the different levels of interactions at institutions themselves. A third point I briefly wanted to come back is the principles and pragmatic dilemma, which, as I alluded to at the beginning, is particularly difficult. In the conversation around principled humanitarian action and principled humanitarian action and humanitarian negotiations. While previously frontline negotiators may have decided based on relatively vague mandates and in conversation with themselves, because before the creation of a community, basically frontline negotiators were individual and confidential actors of a negotiating process. And with the increasing conversation and building of a community of practice and building vertical relationships within institutions between diplomacy and frontline negotiations, you get the dilemma discussion within the institution. Is something a good deal or a rotten compromise? And there are animated debates increasingly. What are the terms and conditions under which, as a humanitarian, can really accept a negotiation in terms of access, for instance? Can you accept to service humanitarian or deliver humanitarian services to people evacuated from a besieged areas if the Secret Service and the militaries of one of the belligerents is registering those coming out and eventually going after them once you have serviced them with humanitarian goods. Is that an acceptable or not an acceptable dilemma? And when it is acceptable in terms of life-saving, and when it is not acceptable in terms of compromising your principles. But the difference today is that these dilemmas, you have them heavily within institutions and within the humanitarian community overall, because with 6,000 organized frontline humanitarian workers, everything which is kind of compromised and negotiated is at the same time debated in the open space. So I wanted just to highlight that the creation of the discipline of humanitarian negotiation, of a more fluid interaction between humanitarian negotiations, diplomacy and humanitarian negotiations has accentuated some of the difficulties and needs, internal negotiation as well, preparation of negotiations, understanding what is acceptable, understanding what the real dilemmas are, and then, of course, difficult choices. Okay. Another element I wanted briefly to highlight is the trust and mistrust issue. I know that traditionally in research, as far as I have seen, there is a predominant opinion that confidence-building measures lead to trust, and that trust is important to negotiate deals. I have become increasingly skeptical whether these equations work. My experience has rather been that in context of conflict and power relationship, confidence-building measures are adding to mistrust rather than to trust, because most of the time confidence building is not working in settings of power and deep mistrust. And I think that's where we are in many of the contexts in which we are operating today and in which humanitarians are. The distrust in society is so deep in conflict that trust building that would work in an economic business setting amongst kind of equal partners in a negotiation is not working in the humanitarian setting. And so mitigating mistrust has become an extremely modest, but also a realistic kind of approach to deal with the trust and mistrust conundrum in today's negotiation. Just like the do no harm, we are in many places not in a comparable situation with forms of humanitarian negotiation. Let me just conclude with a couple of comments beyond humanitarianism. As frontline humanitarian negotiation has increasingly become an accepted template and has proven its usefulness in the humanitarian sector with all the difficulties that I have described, one of the key questions for me is the concept as such of frontline negotiating useful and usable in other areas of negotiation? And since my taking over the Basel Institute on Governance and focusing on anti-corruption, I have continuously compared what anti-corruption is compared to humanitarian settings. And I thought the anti-corruption community is kind of a frontline community because it's very much an isolated community of champions against corruptions, investigators, financial investigation units, prosecutors, some politicians cleaning up the mess of their predecessors. That's the community which forms a hardcore of frontline in the fight against corruption. what from the lessons learned and from the experiences of humanitarian frontline negotiation is a sort of transferable and not transferable to the community of practice of anti-corruption. What, for instance, can we learn also in migration settings? States and NGOs and communities responding to uncontrolled migration movement are confronted with dilemmas similar to the dilemmas humanitarians are confronted at front lines of conflict. And what do we learn about the trade-offs and how to manage these trade-offs and how to manage the trust? And can we conceive migration settings as front lines in which some of the methods and methodologies of frontline humanitarian negotiations are transferable? Can we maybe look at the health sector with impossible dilemmas on cost and services and priorities? Can we consider it as a frontline and organize health response on the basis of the frontline actors in the health sector and what they would recommend and set as priorities? And can a community of practitioners from the health sector maybe bring other types of responses to intrinsic problems in society that we are dealing with? Is here again the community of practice versus institutional issue a template which may be useful to conceive? In 2007, Frank Hoffman pointed out that hybrid warfare would be the dominant feature of conflicts in the 21st century. After more than 2 decades into the century, I couldn't agree more. But hybridity should not be understood as a combination only of kinetic and cyber operations in war. Hybridity is increasingly what we are dealing at all the front lines in which we are confronted with. Peace in times of hybridity will have to be negotiated around hybrid legal environments. There is not international humanitarian law here, and then human rights law here, and economic law here. It's hybrid, complex environment with which we are confronted. The concept of frontline has the advantage to focus on problems and try to formulate solutions to the problems at front lines and not to institutional, bureaucratic, or other logics. And that's what I think is an interesting template for researchers, for all of you, for University of Zurich and beyond, because I do believe that we are entering with complex societies, complex negotiations as an all-encompassing feature of society, a world in which we need to learn from each other. And one of the learning processes could be, one of the templates could be frontline negotiations. I stop it here and I look forward to your questions and comments.
So thank you very much, Peter. So my name is Jack Williams, and I'm the president of the Institute for Global Negotiation. And we know you get a lot of invitations to speak, so we're incredibly happy that you accepted this one. And we wanted to open up the questions and answers to our, or questions, not the answers, the questions to the audience and the responses to Peter. So if you have a question, if you just put up your hand and then one of our roving microphones will come to you. I'd like to ask the first question because I know from experience, if I don't, I won't ask any. So you talked about mandates and red lines in the humanitarian context. Can you go a little bit deeper into why mandates are so important and also maybe some experience you've personally had with that?
Well, look, I think we all agree that mandates and legal frameworks have basically dominated the sector and have defined the sector, and they are identitarian because also they themselves somehow intersect between practical things to do and ethical standards of behavior and society. I think it's something which always struck me when reading and rereading the Geneva Conventions. It's not just a practical guide on how to assist and protect people. It's also an ethical guideline of behavior. And I think these mandates are identitarian. They define a sector, they define an identity, they define an area, and humanitarians are rightly so proud to belong to that unit. I think the problem is, and the problem I wanted to articulate is that while in the 19th until even into the 20th century, you could somehow maintain the fiction that realities were sort of organized along your mandates, and that what was on your mandates and in your law was also reflected in reality. Today, this is much more problematic. We have this hybridization of contexts, of societies, of multi-layered and complex problems that we are dealing with. And I have always held that humanitarians can't just reduce themselves to mandates and law, because that would basically put them out of service. And the basic mandate of humanitarians was to service community, not to service mandates. And in that sense, I think it is important to find the right articulation of what does your mandate say and what was the intention when it was drafted, and what are the problems on the ground that you are encountering. And I think one of the biggest tension, which is the beauty about the CCHN experience and about frontline as a concept, is that when you take frontlines and communities seriously, then you will learn how to interpret your mandate. Because people know themselves what their needs are, and they know it best, and they articulate. And they articulate their needs today beyond the traditional mandates of institutions. They don't need first the respect of the Geneva Conventions and then human rights, and then economic rights. They need all together. They know themselves what their basic needs are, and I think that's the tension we are navigating, and that's also the importance of the concept of frontline. Focuses the attention of institutions on mandates and laws and compliance with laws, which is all fine, into what are the needs articulated by communities and individuals which are suffering, and what do they really need. And then you negotiate what they need because you tap into their wisdom, their intelligence, their articulation. And I think that's the whole issue of reconceptualizing negotiation today, of looking beyond your mandates and looking at problems. And then not to discard the mandates, but to find new ways what you can do under your mandate given the problems. And I think that's maybe what I wanted to really highlight. And we have these tensions in all complex emergencies. negotiation is just one of the stabilization points.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So we have a question, I think at the, oh, yeah, go ahead. Yeah. No, sorry, behind with the mic.
Oh, no, you can start. Are you sure? Okay. Thank you for the very nice speech. My name is Chiara, and my question is more about your personal experience. So I can imagine that when dealing with humanitarian negotiation, you have, of course, also the interest of the people that are whose life are at risk in mind, but that might not be in the best interest of everyone. So you might be dealing with parties that maybe put above their political or economical interests, and I can imagine that's quite frustrating. How do you deal with this probably also strong negative emotions when doing these negotiations?
Well, look, I mean, the key task of a complex negotiation is to find an access door to those who prevent humanitarian work to be delivered. And therefore, you have to find ways of articulating what you need in terms of language, and which is understandable by belligerents. And I think that's the big task and reconciliation that you have to find. I don't think that I'm not really, or I have never been over impressed by negativity. At the end of the day, you know that it is difficult what you are dealing. That's sort of self-evident. But what you need is to think, how can I use or find the crack in the wall? What brings me one step further? What allows me to build on something which is in my mandate and which is my task as a humanitarian, is to find access to populations in need. And then you try to find negotiating moments where what you need is articulated, and you try to articulate it as interests of your counterpart as well. And that's very difficult, and sometimes it fails because you don't find the common point. But the counterparts have also become very much more sophisticated these days. As a president of ICHR, humanitarian coordinator, as High Commissioner on Refugees, you never find governments, not even non-state armed groups, who tell you that you should get lost. People are very nice. And they even are very respectful of mandates and laws, and they have even read the Geneva Conventions and say how important it is. But they may screw you by administrative decisions which would eventually outlaw a special delivery of a humanitarian service. I still remember one of my complicated negotiations in that sense was with a government. I won't say which one here. We had a whole ship of important humanitarian deliveries in the port, and then the sort of health regulation of the country would demand that certain standards, that the percentage of water in tuna fish, that was the negotiation agreement, to find that the percentage of water in tuna fish should not be beyond 60% or 55%. And the percentage was designed not to allow tuna fish from certain countries into that conflict region. And of course, you don't think about these issues. You should probably think, next time you will think, to look at the regulation on tuna fish and water and distribution of fish and water in canned tuna fish. But you then have a blockage which is at the end of the day, you know it's a political approach. They don't want you to deliver humanitarian goods to a population which is hostile to the government. So it's percentage of water in cans of tuna fish. I give this just as an example because that's how frontline humanitarian negotiations and diplomacy today work. It's not about the big principles. The big principles are what the Security Council does in a resolution, and everybody agrees. And you don't advance on these principles because I haven't met in 10 years a belligerent and a military or a minister of defense or a general of an army who would not be fully committed to respect the Geneva Conventions. They all do. But they basically set the negotiation table in a different way on technical obstacles, on health regulation, on whatever you can invent as bureaucratic obstacles. And when they don't know what is still left, they delay your visa agreements for your people, or they imprison your local staff. And that's what you negotiate at the end of the day when we negotiate access or principles. It goes down to water and to fish.
Thank you very much. Next question.
Just to follow up on red lines and access, as you were saying, with the case of Afghanistan, where you have the de facto authorities that are systematically excluding women from public spaces, would you see any use for red lines in negotiations in this case?
Well, there is always use for red lines. The question is a little bit who should have red lines and who shouldn't have, and what are the red lines of which actor? Huh? I have always respected every political or UN actor who had to do red lines in a country. I mean, you can't be the United Nations and not have red lines on women's rights and all kinds of aspirational human rights and other agendas that you represent as an institution. It's normal that at a certain moment you have to have red lines. And sometimes some of the tensions are that when you are a representative of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement, your red lines are slightly different because you don't come with the whole baggage of other aspirational normative systems. You just look at the basics, at the mandates, your conventions, and you have an imperative of servicing people in the context that you have. And then the walkaway point is just a different one. The walkaway point at a certain moment is the do no harm test for the Red Cross movement. And that's different from a red line expressed through the international system, the human rights system, or the international system as a whole. And that's perfectly legitimate. And a do no harm test looks a little bit different. You have to see how long you can operate in the country in order not to harm. You are not asked to fight for women's rights in Afghanistan when you are a humanitarian actor. You appreciate if they are there because it facilitates your humanitarian work. But as long as you can somehow do life-saving and assist and protect people at a reasonable amount of standards, then you will walk away later. You will walk away. We have walked away from some prison visits because we saw that if we visit prisons, there are reprisals to prisoners that we have visited. So you walk away and you disengage from this type. That's the do no harm test. And then the second thing I would like to highlight is that although the do no harm principle is the core guideline which informs negotiation of a Red Cross movement in Afghanistan, nevertheless, I mean for the functionality of your movement. Then I go in arguments, I would go tuna fish. I would make my argument for women participation in Afghanistan a technical condition without which I can't operate. And so that's how, for instance, we managed till today, to at the ICRC to have women in our operation in Afghanistan, and they are in hospitals and they deliver, and they are even in teaching hospitals, trained as nurses and doctors. And that was the result of a negotiation process with the Talibs, because we told them, if this is no, 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 there is no sense of having a humanitarian operation. And they grudgingly, at the end of the day, they found it more important to have the International Red Cross in 35 hospitals of the country and training doctors and nurses, even if 30% or 40% of them are women, than to follow some of the policies that they have declared against other institutions. So I think we have to conceive these difficulties also as we are in a multi-actor environment in which every actor has its own sort of policies, guidelines, principles, engagement rules, and you have to understand where each one is coming from, and sometimes the ones or the other, because of how they define what they do, are able to step into a place in which others are not able to step in. And the UN has its advantages in certain cases, and NGOs have in others, and local NGOs have in others, and international NGOs have a special profile. All these actors in the difficult environment have all their policies, guidelines, profiles, red lines, or frameworks in which they operate. And I think it's important to understand, to see the limits, the possibilities, and then this will inform humanitarian negotiation.
Thank you. Next question. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your presentation. I'm Kevin, and I would like to know how, because you mentioned the people we need to reach while negotiating maybe access. So I'd like to know how the acceptance parameter can be included while designing the humanitarian negotiation, or even prior that, like while designing an access strategy. So that's my question. Thank you.
Well, look, the theory is that you negotiate access and you prioritize where the highest needs are. The practice is that it is very difficult to assess objectively needs which inform your access strategy, because very often you don't know, because you don't have access. And so you are in the conundrum of navigating an unsecure environment and defining priorities of your access strategies to what you believe is true and what and where you believe the biggest needs are. Acceptance is good as soon as you have access, and there you need flexibility in humanitarian work in particular. And I think that's where humanitarian actors very often have screwed up in the past, because they come with prefabricated ideas what needs are. And that may be important as a first step, because you have to have an idea what you do the next day. But I think the corrective element then is what I would call accountability to affected populations. Once you have access, you need to consult with communities. You need to design what communities needs to what you are able to offer. You need to bring in other expertise if other expertise is necessary. And the acceptance grows through contact with communities. And I think that's where we are still struggling today in the humanitarian sector. It's difficult, it's objectively difficult. But you need to listen to people and communities on what their needs are. In order to listen to them, you have to have access. You can't have access without bringing something. And so you do by trial and error. You do by trial and error. But most of the time, let's be very frank, in today's world, most of the time, at least in the long run, communities don't need what humanitarians at the origin want and are able to bring. And there is a reconciliation here to make continuously. People at the end of the day in communities in war, they need some income, they need schools for kids, they need jobs for family incomes, they need different things. And you have to know what do you need in order to have them survive, so that you create conditions for other types of activities. But that's part of the situation. In terms of acceptance, look, it's one of the toughest situations for frontline humanitarian workers is to go into difficult to reach areas after long periods of difficulties, besiegement, and violations and violence. Because most of the time, contrary to what maybe naively you would believe, you are not welcome most of the time, because you are the first person they meet after having been besieged, bombed. And the first person normally gets the grudge and resentment and frustrations of communities. And that's one of the most psychologically and personally difficult situations in which frontline humanitarian negotiators. They negotiate on an idea of what is needed, and once they are successful, they have difficulties getting acceptance for their presence. And that's how it is. But I think here as well, it's part of the humanitarian experience and negotiating process that you need to be aware of this situation. You need to be aware of the tensions. You can't negotiate away the fact that people have resentments against whoever seems to be wrongly or rightly responsible for what they are experiencing, and you have to deal with those difficult tensions you are encountering. And then slowly to have a process of acceptance and acceptability for what you are dealing. And the process of acceptance and acceptability goes into community consultations, it goes into engaging with local organizations, it goes into supporting them, it goes into not patronizing as knowing about the solution, it goes about attitude, posture, behavior, which is so critically important in those tense relationships that normally frontline context of.
Thank you very much. So just to say, we've got quite a few questions. So we're going to come to one in the room and then go to one online. We have a red line, unfortunately, because we feel we need one, otherwise we could go on all night. So we'll take the question in the room. Yeah.
Thank you so much for enlightening us. My name is Yash, and I really like the correlation, and I'm curious about it, that you made between anti-corruption negotiations and frontline workers. And I wanted to know more, and how can humanitarian negotiation, these challenges and opportunities, the skills that we learned, can be applied to other areas and policy matters, and how can they make impact? Like, are there other domains and areas where we can apply these skills and learn? Thank you.
Well, as I mentioned, I think the field is open to your imagination. Huh? I tried to present some of the approaches that frontline humanitarian negotiations took over the last 10 years broad. And it has developed methods, methodologies, trainings. It has created communities. It has created peer reviews. It has created instruments which have proven useful to the humanitarian community at frontlines. And it has been embraced by this community, which carries them forward without being even institutionally organized. And my sense is that this model and some of these tools and experiences can eventually be useful. Huh? At the Basel Institute, I started to really see how we can connect communities beyond geographies and not just look at country programs and how we support a special anti-corruption effort in a country, but also see how can we connect the anti-corruption officer in Peru, Mozambique, Central African Republic, Tanzania, Ukraine, and other places in order to exchange experience. It's this horizontal connectivity of building communities which are transcending mandates, structures, and accountability lines and so on. And I think from there, the imagination is open to you, whether you go into business, whether you go into other types of negotiation, you probably find always a front line. And then it's up to your imagination and test and experience and review of a scientific and methodological approach to negotiations, which tools are useful and how do they have to be done. But I'm convinced increasingly that first and foremost, the instruments of community of practice, of peer learning, peer review, these are elements which we find in other places of negotiations and which are usefully sort of developed as in a broader community of practitioners than just humanitarian or anti-corruption or migration or human rights.
Thank you very much. So we'll have one final question, which will come from one of our participants online.
Exactly. Anka from Romania is asking, how does the humanitarian negotiation community monitor potential or latent conflicts, and what does it do to prevent them becoming active? And they all seem to be enjoying your keynote, so that just to put that in there.
Well, look, I have here also a little bit of a doctrinal and a practical response. Theoretically, the humanitarian community is not supposed to care about peace, isn't it? They are mitigating impact of violence and conflict. And one critical element of the humanitarian community that it is informed by neutral and impartial humanitarian action. That's the template, and neutral and impartial is uncontroversial as good as possible and consensual as good as possible. And there is nothing as divisive as peace and human rights and all these agendas. So there is a tension, obviously, between mitigating the impact of violence on people and societies and making this your mandate, and the fact that I'm deeply convinced we can't stand just with this and just say, for the rest, let's be happy with conflict and war as long as they continue. That's not an acceptable ethical, moral, and political stance. And that's the reason why I have become a strong advocate when I was a humanitarian, even more than when I was in human rights or in peace work, that humanitarians have to be at the same time bridge builders to reconciling societies. And if they won't be able necessarily to go as far as political actors and human rights actors and anti-corruption actors and peace negotiators in what they are doing, they can't retract themselves into just being humanitarians and disconsider the fundamental sort of objectives of societies to have peace and development and human rights informing their societies. And what I think, if we have this tension, what it says to humanitarians is that when designing humanitarian action, you have also to design it in a way in which you're mitigating of the impact of violence becomes a stepping stone towards the reconciliation of belligerents. And I can tell you that's the critical issue of each and every day and each and every morning of a humanitarian is, for instance, to see how can you design a water project so that separated communities are basically nudged into working together around a water project and not being divided by the water. And at the ICRC, that was one of our big worries, that whenever we designed an operation, we wanted to design it in a way that the indirect impact, not necessarily the declared impact of the project, but the indirect impact of the project would go beyond humanitarians. Between 2014 and 2022 February, we were basically entertaining the water distribution systems on the front line in eastern Ukraine. We managed, rehabilitated the water distribution system because the centrifuges and the water and the pipes were basically crossing the front lines. So the ones had the generators and the others had the pipes. And so you design water projects in a way that they force belligerent communities to basically help. That's what humanitarians can do if they are smart and intelligent, and if they don't retract onto mandates and cores and just preventing the worst in society. But it's a delicate line, I accept. And you may be closer to falling from the rope than when you don't do that. But you are also better off if you do it successfully. And so it's one of these dilemmas which is really important that we are always cognizant. I have always thought it's pretty stupid to conceive that in a war, humanitarian law is the only law which we should care about. People have rights, and these rights have different expressions in different contexts. And because people are unified people and peace and human rights are unified concept, you have to somehow define your relationship as a humanitarian to those big aspirations of societies, and you have to try out how far you can go in order to design your project so that they are conducive to the bigger objective in society without letting you be screwed by the accusation that you are not anymore neutral. And this is a fine line, but it's an important line to go. And I think it's one of the most critical lines that is part of a humanitarian negotiation. It's really the principle versus pragmatism line, which you have to walk delicately in in so difficult context.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So thank you very much. Is that still working? Yeah. So thank you very much for this engaging presentation and Q&A. We have gone beyond our red line, but I think I'm sure everyone here agrees that that's a good thing after what we've heard this evening. So we're very pleased also that for our conference participants, we're going to have a facilitator from the Center for Competence on Humanitarian Negotiation joining us tomorrow. So they're going to get a deep dive into the methodology which was discussed. So Peter, you said that, or when we first met, you mentioned that as a 16-year-old young gentleman, you went to my hometown of Eastbourne to learn English. So we thought rather than bringing you something from Zurich, we'd get you something from Eastbourne. So thank you very much. It fits the bill of a joke present, I think. But we also got a bottle of wine, which might be a little bit more satisfying. No, that's from somewhere more fitting. So thank you very much to all of you who are here. You're all invited to join the apéro, which we're going to have in the Lichthof outside. And you're also encouraged to become a member of the Institute for Global Negotiation. We're a very broad community of practice, so with students, professionals, and academics, but we're trying to follow in the model set out in the frontline negotiations idea. So we'd love for you to join us and become a member if you'd like to. So thank you very much, and yeah, we can go and have a glass of wine.